Contingency log, number 67. Code name, son of Poseidon. We don't get to choose our parentage, nor what kind of baggage may come with it. Some may end up living normal lives, while others find themselves having to face the consequences of decisions made by someone else. But then there are those who seem to be the direct consequence of simply living. This was the life for Percy Jackson for a very impressionable period of his life. From the age of 12, he would not only begin to learn just who he is, but also the darker implications for his mere existence. While his mother may have been human, it was his father's side of the family which proved important. And if the name of this contingency hadn't spelled it out already. Percy Jackson is the son of the god of the sea, Poseidon. His mother, try as she might, could not keep the truth about that aspect of his life a secret forever. And she would soon take him to a camp where he would be safer than he would be otherwise. Dubbed Camp Half-Blood, it was a safe haven for other children similar to Percy. Those who have been sired by a god, but quickly abandoned. This repeat commonality between them causing an issue of which I will delve further into later in the video. In this camp, the children would not only learn the full extent of their strength and powers, but it would also keep them safe long enough to be able to fend for themselves. Percy, however, would not be able to learn as the other demigods did, as the call to action would ring loud in his ear, not only forcing him to leave the camp, but also put his own life at risk time and time again. I know some of you may say I am one to talk given my choice of Robins, but they at least had training before being sent on the field, or were already skilled in their own right. So to watch a boy so young who has just barely learned of what he is have to face all of this, it makes you wonder just how something like this could be allowed to happen. Again, I'll get into that later. Fortunately, being born from one of the big three gods had granted Percy impeccable power. As one would expect, being the son of the god of the sea has granted Percy the ability to control it. However, his strength is far deeper than that, as when he is in direct contact with the water, specifically contact with the ocean, Percy will find his strength increased exponentially. The strength he obtains when in contact with the ocean is rather impressive, as when standing in the water of the beach, Percy Jackson was capable of holding his own against Ares, an imposing man who towers over the preteen. He is also the god of war, if that gives you a better idea. Granted, I am more than convinced that Ares was not giving it his all during that confrontation, as I doubt Ares would like to incur the wrath of Poseidon by killing his son, though there were many around that would more than love to end Percy's existence. Water also cannot harm him, his best example being when he would fall from the top of the St. Louis Gateway Arc into the waters below. The arc at its peak reaches over 600 feet, the current record being held by Lasso Schaller, who fell from 192 feet, but he had a team behind him as well as trained to do so. Honestly, pretty sure Percy could also survive a fall from space at this point. But don't think that his durability is only good under certain circumstances, as Percy once survived the eruption of Mount St. Helens, an eruption that he himself caused with the drawback of unleashing Typhon. Worry not, as this was eventually handled by Percy's father, rather effortlessly if you ask me. I'm sure many of you have an idea of just how devastating a volcanic eruption is, and Percy was within that volcano when it all happened. And believe it or not, he only gets more durable than this. Deep within the Greek underworld known as Tartarus exists the body of water known as the river Styx. Typically, to cross this river, one would need to pay the toll, but Percy needed something else. I'm sure many of you are well versed on Greek mythology, or at the very least, know of the hero by the name of Achilles. As a boy, he was dipped into this very river by his mother, who held him by his ankles. This resulted in his body being indestructible. Well, most of it anyway. This is also where the phrase Achilles' heel stems from, as it was the only weakness he had. Percy himself would also plunge his body into this river, pulling himself out. But unlike Achilles, his weakness was in a different spot. Instead, it was the small of his back, something only a handful of people know. This increase in durability added to his own power. Percy was now able to hold his own against some of the most powerful gods the Greek pantheon had to offer. This allowed him to hold his own against even the likes of Hades, even allowing him to fight a near-endless battle to escape Tartarus. This would be the second time he'd done this, by the way. Gives the phrase "to hell and back" a deeper meaning. I have to tip my metaphorical hat to this boy. Sure, he is the son of Poseidon, so one would assume that he is going to be powerful just from that. In truth, there are many people in history who are secretly sired by one of the main three, those being Poseidon, Hades, and Zeus. Though not all of them were anywhere near as selfless as Percy is. This resulted in an agreement between the three gods. I'll get into that in a bit. But being the son of the god of the sea doesn't define all of Percy. He is a boy with an unbreakable will, and has the body to turn his desires into reality. With his trusty sword Riptide, Percy has faced gods and titans, and even in times when he is forced to a knee, Percy would rise again and demand more, whatever it took to protect those he loves. In only a short few years, Percy had slayed Medusa, defeated Polyphemus, a distant cousin, traded blows with Atlas, and even managed to hold up the very sky alone. I may not know how hard a feat like that is to accomplish in itself, but I do know someone who experienced it, someone who had redefined what unbreakable is, and yet even he would struggle with this for just a day. Percy would not do this effortlessly, however. In fact, the strain it put on his body would cause some of his hair to turn white as a result. Still, to be able to battle Atlas, who had been doing this for who knows how many years, is rather impressive, as this was something he'd done before his dip into the river Styx. Each battle would further hone Percy, like a sword whose edge was slowly being sharpened. His edge would grow sharper with every battle, leading up to a battle he'd been trying so hard to avoid happening. That would be his battle against Kronos, the king of gods and the titan of time. He was a being who'd been overthrown by Zeus. Kronos returned by possessing the body of another demigod, who'd also dipped into the river Styx. Percy was instrumental in this fight, not only because he was the only other combatant who was nearly invincible, but because through his humanity, Percy was able to reach the boy, and he would sacrifice his life by revealing his weak point. A death of someone who was corrupted by the world he'd been forced to be a part of. I believe it's time I talked about the true conflict of this book series. Many would believe that Kronos was the true antagonist of this story, though I am willing to bet that there are some who had discovered the truth by now. You see, the gods of this world are known for having multiple children, not just the big three. The problem is just how many of them they have. Some gods having sired children and then forgetting not just about their existence, but that it had ever happened in the first place. This resulted in an imbalance within Camp Half-Blood. Demigods who would find themselves in camp with no knowledge of just which god they'd come from. If not for Hermes, many of them wouldn't even be able to live within the cabins. Some having been there for years, still not sure who their other parent was. This feeling of ostracization being something that would fester and grow within them. You see, for Kronos to awaken, he needed to amass the power required to do so. This would come in the form of the allegiance of an army of demigods. And it wasn't as hard to obtain this as one would believe. While this would mean turning against their parent, the truth is, many of the demigods had no reason to side with someone who would never acknowledge their existence. This failure in the system of gods not being able to interact with the endless offspring they'd created being the instrument of their own downfall. I can't say I blame them. If you'll allow me to explain myself, while I can't say I agree with siding with Kronos, the actions he'd done in the past being enough to know that he would not be someone to be trusted. If nothing else, it's clear his betrayal of the demigods would be a factor of when not if. But I can still understand the feelings of these kids, the loneliness, the empty feeling of not being able to get the love they wanted. I've had many who I can call my children, kids who I hoped that I made a difference in their lives, kids who sometimes I've let down, burned bridges, maybe even betrayed their trust. But they're still my kids, and I'd never deny this. This is why on a certain level I cannot say the gods hadn't brought this upon themselves. Fortunately, Percy would call them out for this, after being granted a wish by the gods as thanks for his aid in defeating Kronos. Believing that he would wish to become a full god, Percy surprised them all by demanding the gods repair the damage they initially caused, telling the gods that they need to change their system and finally acknowledge the children they'd created. Noble to the end. Honestly, this is a hard contingency to make. Not just because of how powerful he is, but the idea of a boy like this needing one doesn't bring me any joy. I know I make these contingencies as a failsafe against anyone who could pose a threat against the world, but just because I feel that this is necessary doesn't mean I like it. To counter Percy, I need to contend with a few factors: his power amplification from the ocean, and his level of control of water, as I'm still unsure if he would be able to rip the water out of the human body if needed. To err on the side of caution, I'm going to assume he can. My best option would be to place him somewhere without access to water, perhaps dropping him in the middle of the Sahara, as well as repurpose some contingencies I'd created for Aquaman, someone who actively refused be a part of this. Can't blame him. Either way, inducing aquaphobia onto Percy would likely prevent him not only from amplifying his power and healing any damage, but dehydration could also aid in exhausting Percy further. I say this because Percy's greatest strength, that being his invulnerability, is also his greatest weakness, and I don't mean the one weak point he has, as I will do everything in my power to avoid exploiting that. But you see, the gift he'd obtained from the river Styx has a major drawback. This invulnerability comes as the cost of an extremely high drain of his stamina. During the final battles, Percy would need to sleep between combat in order to replenish his strength. While he himself doesn't feel tired, his body would be rendered unconscious the moment he'd close his eyes. While it may require a bigger show of force than I'd like, I've prepared a small army of drones with the goal of making them as hard to deal with as possible. Armed with long-ranged weapons to continue to hold his attention, their job will be to force Percy into combat for as long as possible. My hope being that the moment his body reaches its limit, he will simply pass out. Afterwards, my plan is to get Percy off of the planet, holding him as far from the ocean and any other contact with water as possible. I plan to keep him within a dreamlike state, something to keep his mind busy as I try to figure out what had caused him to turn, as I currently refuse to believe he'd turn to the dark side of his own accord. But if it does come to that, I have a more permanent form of containment, a cryo-sleep that'll keep Percy under indefinitely. I pray it doesn't come to that, as I'd rather not lose someone like him. But I'll do what I must. If you also have a character you wish for me to cover, or just want to support this channel, I'll have a link to my Ko-fi page. There will also be a Google Doc with the list of characters who have ever been done or already commissioned by others.